Before we talk about my new technique, we need to cover some background and context on backhand in general. So from a big picture, 50,000 foot level, as I've been saying, the forehand and backhand look and function in a very similar way. At the highest levels in the modern era, the backhand is a whip swing driven by the rotating body, the kinetic chain of rotation that is built into our system and has evolved over, many long eons. And as I've said before, the same principles and feels of a high-level modern swing on the forehand side will apply almost equally on the backhand side. So both strokes will have to be performed from an athletic posture, not the standing vertical and stiff body posture that we see in recreational tennis, but a athletic form, where there's a tilt of the body and there's weight into the lower body and a ready for movement kind of feel. Both forehand and backhand have an underlying functionality of throwing, and both in the windup and in the release, there is a throwing action that is a free release of the racket that we get when we throw a ball or throw a frisbee or throw a discus. The other thing that's in common, of course, is the whip principle, that we're building up this coiling and wind up in our body so that we get to a point where we can produce a whip-like effect with the racket. And this is going to be 3 or 4 times faster than the old linear levering, pushing action that we see in most recreational players. Of course, we have the foundation of the kinetic chain as driving all this process, which is 32 body segments, all going in rotation in sequence and building speed and power as they go up the body. This is a foundational principle of both the forehand and the backhand. In addition, as opposed to what most recreational players think about both the forehand and the backhand swing, they tend to think of it as a horizontal circular action, something like this, forehand side like this. And yes, for the topspin, maybe they have an idea that there's this sort of ascending arm motion. But in that conception of this sort of round circular action, they think of the release coming in this horizontal swinging gate action on the backhand side and the forehand side, when in fact we're going to see that just as on the forehand side, the racket from the slot is coming up on edge, and that it comes up on edge from the start and goes through a whole windshield wiper action from beginning to end. And that same dynamic is in play on the backhand. We come out of the slot on edge and we're throwing out on edge. So here we see Roger Federer's backhand, maybe not considered the best of all time, but among the best single backhanders, of course. And we'll discuss in detail why he may not be the best. And I don't think he is the best. But when we talk about one-handed versus two-handed backhand, we need to understand something extremely important right from the beginning, is that 2/3 of the one-handed backswing is done with two hands. So we're starting off initially, of course, grasping in a ready position with our two hands, but then in the one-handed, the non-dominant hand slides up to the throat of the racket in one form or another, and then this is taken back with two hands. So that's phase one of the backhand, right? And then going this way now, the the opponents this way. But once we get it back here, then we also have to drop the racket and drop the racket head so that as we come up, racket head is going to be underneath the ball and we can create topspin. And the second phase, the drop into the slot, is also accomplished with two hands. It's only as we come out of the slot does the non-hitting hand drop off in the one-handed backhand and we have a one-handed release. But this whole process takes typically about a second. So 3/4 or 2/3 of a second is taken up with two hands on the racket for the one-hander. And only in the last third of a second is the one-handed release accomplished. However, every time you watch television, which I just was watching the match this week with Team and Wawrinka, the commentators always talk about what a beautiful one-handed backhand they have. And, you know, it's just truly, you know, probably the most beautiful thing in tennis is this one-handed backhand. And yet we're seeing the demise of this one-handed backhand. Among the top 100 male players, only 10 use a single-handed technique. And 4 of those, Dimitrov, Gasquet, Thiem, and Wawrinka, they're close to retirement or are going to retire soon. So it's, you know, it seems to be heading for oblivion. One of the questions I want to address in this article is, you know, is that inevitable, or is the one-hander inevitably going to oblivion? And I think you'll see that it's not necessarily that way. So in terms of developing a better one-handed or two-handed backhand, I would say the boulder problem is this issue of the width and the space that we have on the backhand side when we're in the take back and drop into the slot. This is the most difficult thing to overcome, and I certainly faced that challenge as well. And it was only partially successful until I developed this new better technique, which I'll explain. So we need sufficient spacing for our arms to be able to drop this racket back here with sufficient length and depth so that we can build the momentum for the swing, and then also drop the racket head as it comes out of the slot so that we can have this sharply ascending release. In sum, the boulder problem is that the take back and drop is too cramped for comfort and for ease. Extremely difficult to learn to overcome this. That is the boulder problem. Now, as you can see in the slides in the background, for the two-handed backhand player, this problem is much, much easier, because with two hands at the end part of the racket, they can extend this racket back so much further and have so much freedom and more control over the racket with two hands, and in order to swing and drop this into the slot. And I think there's other reasons, of course, but this is one of the main reasons that the two-handed technique has become so dominant in the modern era. The two-handed coordinates the swinging arms with the rotating body better and helps us load and unload the body-driven motion typically better than the single-handed take back and release, which will tend to start to disconnect the hitting arm with the rotating body, and we get the arm action going off on its own. But what people don't often talk about is that though the pros are adopting the two-handed technique, they are giving up some things in that two-handed technique. They're giving up the ability to reach a ball from the two-handed side. That's one of the reasons why there's no two-handed forehands out there anymore, is that we have a much longer reach with the single-handed than the two hands. So if we had two hands on the forehand, you can see how much more restricted my swing arc can be than one hand. Same thing applies on the backhand side. And the other thing that is we give up is some amount of speed with the free release of the arm in the swinging motion. On the forehand side, typically with one hand, players get 15% more speed than they can with their two-handed backhand side. On average, something like that. So the two-handed backhand is slower and has a more restricted reach. We'll get into this in more detail. You can see in the slide in the background, I say that this free release and unrestricted arc of the arm with one hand is the reason why we throw a frisbee with one arm only. We never throw it like this. The same thing will apply to a discus that we'll see in a moment. So we talked earlier about the commentators bemoaning the loss of the beautiful one-handed backhand in tennis. So this throwing motion that we're talking about is beautiful for a reason, and you can see in this ancient statue of Discobulus, who's the discus thrower, and this is a statue that was made around 450 BC of an Olympic Greek athlete, you know, in the discus throwing motion. And it represents, you know, the ideal of the athletic form in which we're seeing the spiraling, rotating energy that we've been talking about all along. But we also see the harmony and the balance and the power that comes from this unfurling and flinging action, either with a frisbee or with a discus. So there is a reason that we throw the discus and the frisbee with one arm. And this has a lot to do with the radius of the arc of the swing that we can produce with one arm versus two. So is there a way to keep this beautiful one-handed stroke in the game of tennis? Let me propose a way. So is there a way of overcoming this cramped position in the take back and drop in the slot for the one-hander? What I discovered this new technique after a long frustration is, what if we, instead of doing it like everyone's always done it with the non-hitting hand, grasping the throat or the racket in the take back and having this cramped position back here, what if we just grip the racket like the normal two-hander would down here at the end of the handle, but then we, from there, acted like it was a single-handed backhand. So now you can see how much further my arms are extending away from the body, just like Novak or Nadal would do. But I'm thinking one-handed, not two hands in my release. But now I have control of this racket head in the handle here with both hands, and I have more maneuverability, I think, and flexibility and space and width and depth and all the things that we need to just wind up and drop this into the slot in a much more fluid, powerful way than I had when I was getting all cramped up in here. That's the essence of the new technique. So what I found in trying this new technique on all the existing one-handed models is that it improved them all, as there was much more width, space, and lack of restriction to do any particular one-handed model. So basically, this would be a way of getting the width and space that a two-hander has, but also getting the unrestricted arc and the speed that comes from a one-handed release. So I'm calling this the hammer whip backhand technique, because just like in a hammer throw, the hammer thrower grasps the handle that is attached to a line and a ball at the end with two hands, and his arms are extended away from the body, and then he circles this, and then eventually he flings it out. Yes, using two hands, but the basic rotational action, the pulling of the arms away from the body in a wide circle, you know, is a hammer throw. So hence my name, the hammer throw backhand. So now, this is like a Dominic team, if you can remember, team's backhand. We'll be getting into it. You know, he has a high straight arm out here, and when he had his existing technique with a non-hitting hand on the throat, this extension was always a little bit difficult, and it always looked stiff and awkward because this arm had to be so bent with holding the throat of the racket. But if you move that hand down to the end, now you can extend your arms out here like this without any feeling of discomfort. In fact, once you get used to it, it's very comfortable. And then you can have a bigger wind up, and then you can keep the hand on a little bit longer even, which we'll talk about, but most typically you don't really need it, and you can release it as you come out of this. A few more explanatory words around the word hammer technique and why I chose that. Because on the surface, somebody might say, well, Kim, you're saying that we have a wider swing arc and possibly greater speed with a greater swing radius with one arm. But in the hammer throw, they swing this ball around their body 4 or 5 times and release it with 2 hands. So it's a two-handed release, which is true. So why do they do that? Well, because at the end of this grip and line, there's a 16-pound ball that the hammer thrower is throwing. The same ball, essentially, that the shot putter shot puts. So in rotating this 4 or 5 times around the body before releasing it, the 16-pound ball is building up tremendous centrifugal outward pulling force on the body, arms, and hands. And so, yes, the hammer thrower has to hang on with both arms and hands to twirl it and throw it. But the reason that we don't have that same issue in tennis or in frisbee throwing or discus is this frisbee only weighs a couple ounces. So it'd make no sense to try to throw it with 2 arms, right? And a discus only weighs slightly over 2 pounds. So again, we're gonna use the wider arc and faster swing speed of a single arm release. And in the same way, even though we're gonna, in this new technique, grip the racket down here at the end of the handle, somewhat like and take it back somewhat like a wide arc like a hammer thrower might, and wind it up and release it. This only weighs 10 or 11 ounces. So there's really no necessity to hold on to it for 2 hands in order to control it. We can release it with 1 arm and get all the whipping power and speed that we want. I'm not saying that 2 hands doesn't have its place, obviously does. It is the preferred technique for a variety of reasons that we'll get into more and we've already discussed. But so that's the reason that I'm calling it the hammer whip, is that, yeah, we sort of 2/3 of the stroke we're controlling with 2 hands and 2 arms, but there's that whip component that if we choose to, we can release and do with 1 arm. So that's the hammer whip explanation. Slot. So now the 3 phases that we have to go through in every stroke is, you know, we have the take back, and like I said, with Novak, it's take back, he has the racket extending out here like this nice wide arc, and he has the racket tipped out, and then he gradually brings it up on edge back here, and he extends way back here with a straight arm. Well, now we could do the same thing with the one-handed backhand using the team model up here, and we can drop into the slot with 2 hands, just like they do. But then as we come out of the slot, we can, if we choose to, we can release this hand and get a wider arc and a faster swing speed with the single-handed. Said that this new technique, hammer whip technique, helped me improve all the different one-handed models that I worked on, and I certainly worked on Gasquet's model for weeks on end. And so without further ado, I'll show you First I'll show you Gasquet executing his stroke, and then my version of the Gasquet backhand using the hammer whip model. You can take a look at it for yourself. So what are the advantages and potential advantages of this new one-handed technique? Of course, it immediately addresses the boulder problem in the backhand, which is that you're going to have more width and depth in the take back and the drop into the slot. I think it'll give you greater racket head control because you're not going to be in this cramped position, and then as you get dropping into the slot, it's even more difficult. Now you have a lot more freedom and space to operate, controlling the racket at the end of the handle. I think it has the potential to produce greater topspin and racket head speed with the free release on the single hand with a wider arc. Certainly, I think the two-handed take back of the hammer will give you better take back control and consistency as you move through this whole process. And then overall greater racket head speed because you're going to be able to load your body more effectively and have a longer arm and swing path in this whole process with this new technique. Now, before you get too worried that we're going to be on this alarming, radical new course the whole time, we're not. I want to spend a couple of lessons talking about and having you try out this new technique, but we will be covering all the traditional two-handed and one-handed techniques, and I'll teach you everything that I learned and all the dead ends that I reached and try to overcome those more quickly for you. But I do want you to explore this because I think it will open up some new understandings of the backhand in general. And so, you know, is this whole idea that I'm introducing here of a two-handed take back and one-handed release, is that just simply crazy? Well, it's really not. You know, and some of the greatest ball strikers of all time in sports basically use this technique, including the one you see on the slide behind me, which is Ken Griffey Jr., who many analysts think had the most beautiful baseball swing of all time. And it was also incredibly effective and powerful. He hit 630 home runs in his career. And, you know, Babe Ruth hit 712, but you can see how much power and speed he could generate with his technique. And basically it was a two-handed coil and take back, and he kept the hand on sometimes through the whole swing, and other times, especially far out in the plate, he would release the hand as you see in the picture behind me. And again, we see a whole spectrum of people that release early or only partially or relax their hand. There's a whole range, but some of the greatest hitters of all time that I've listed here had a release of this trail hand fully or partially in their swinging process. And it's just not in applies to baseball alone. In golf, we've had the same history of players that have had their trail hand partially or fully releasing on the club, including probably the most famous was Vijay Singh, former #1 professional golfer in the world. Won 3 Grand Slams, 59 titles, and one of the longest hitters on the tour. And, you know, he frequently would release and relax his hand to take it off at the end, towards the end, in the process of the release. And I'll have a short video clip in the notes section where you can see both Ken Griffey Jr. taking his hand off the racket and swinging, and Vijay Singh. So I encourage you to take a look at those. But again, in addition, some of the greatest golfers of all time have also had a partial trail hand release in their golf swing. For now, just think about how this slinging action, frisbee action with the strings facing down, felt for you and how effective it was. I hope that you'll sense the potential in that movement. So in wrapping up, reminding you that the overall theme of the model that we're talking about is the Kinetic Whip Backhand. You've seen enough of my technique, my latest experimentation, for you to go out and try that for yourself, and I encourage you to do that. Play around with it in experimental mode. Don't get too caught up in whether you can do it so well at the beginning. I'd rather have it, you think of it as an exploration of this issue of cramping and take back, the space and width and control of the racket issue, the boulder problem. And I think this will just kind of give you some feeling for the issues that we're going to be talking about in more detail. But at the end of the day, it's not really about you adopting my technique. That doesn't really matter. It's about adopting a more kinetic whip model for your backhand that we'll be focused on. In the end here, I want to return to Alex Honnold's great achievement, the free solo climb of El Capitan, and encourage you to look at the clip, 1.5-minute clip I'll have in the notes about how he solved the boulder problem, or tried to solve it, and recommend that you go see the whole movie about it, which is called Free Solo. The last thing that I want to leave you with is something that was interesting about that story. It turns out, as Alex told the story to the filmmaker, is that he didn't share his goal with a lot of people or publicly. And so why didn't he do that? Well, he didn't really want the added pressure that comes with that kind of setting out that public goal, and all the worry and concern about falling and all the other things that would come into play. He didn't want that to distract his focus. And so he didn't share, except for a few close friends, you know, and training partners. And that's the last thing that I'll leave you with today about this plan for improvement on your backhand or forehand serve, whatever, is I would say don't share. Don't share this publicly with your social and tennis group. As soon as you do that, you're putting added pressure and distraction on yourself. And typically, and I've seen this 1,000 times and experienced it 1,000 times, if you tell someone, oh, I'm going to build myself a Wawrinka backhand, well, your social tennis competitive players are not going to greet this with anything but scorn and mockery. Because what's going to happen as soon as you try to hit a backhand like Wawrinka and you hit the ball into the fence or over the fence, well, your tennis friends are going to say, what the heck? You're crazy. You're paying for lessons perhaps to become a worse player. You're making these horrible mistakes. And in the short term, you probably are making some horrible mistakes. And in the short term, you could say you're playing worse tennis. So that's going to be the perspective of people in general about your improvement plan. So I would say don't share, only with your training partner and your coach, what your goals are. Just tell people you're working on your game, and leave it at that. So I would say that you should be more like Pete Sampras, who said, you know, I'm going to let my racket do my talking. And so when you run into this issue, don't share. Make a commitment to let your racket do the talking down the road, and we'll see who gets the last laugh.